Myths are, by definition, widely held but false beliefs. Throughout history, societies have come to depend on certain myths to explain the inexplainable, to defend controversial actions, and to promote the status quo without question. In order for a myth to become widely accepted and seldom questioned by society, it must be taught as fact, and dissenters must be disregarded as fringe members of society. In America, we rely on the myth that capitalism is the best and final system of government. There are many benefits to believing that capitalism is inevitable. For one, this belief takes away the responsibility the U.S. has for many of the horrific ramifications of capitalism, as no alternative option is seen as possible. Another reason many support this myth of inevitability is that under the system of capitalism, those who are rich and powerful remain rich and powerful. Histories are told by the rich and powerful, and when you are the one telling the story, you can easily bend it to your benefit. The rationale, which states capitalism is the final form of economic development, is an argument touted in fallacies and put forward to convince ordinary people that the current system of economics in America, which is dependent on socially systemic inequalities, is the destiny of the world, and there is no point in rallying action to change it. This belief promotes apathy when it comes to changing the system and encourages all those living in the current system to blindly agree with it. At this point in our lives, we are well aware that the American public education system is very flawed. For most who graduate through this system, the stories taught in civics classes reflect patriotic ideas that seldomly critique the United States. We are taught that Manifest Destiny was a time of American revelry and patriotism, and the genocide of indigenous peoples heavily glossed over. We are taught that America is the greatest superpower in the world, but what we don't learn is the history our country has of abusing our positions as a world superpower, creating political unrest in developing countries, and manipulating global politics on a grand scale to ensure the best trade deals for our economy. Part of our higher education has been relearning these lessons and examining our collective histories with a more critical lens. With greater perspective, we can see that so many of the myths we learned are untrue. We are able to see that oppression runs rampant, not only in our country, but in our world, and that America has always been very far from great. So, with the understanding that many of the lessons we have learned about our country and its history are not entirely accurate, or at least not the whole story, it's important to re-examine a fundamental system that we were taught was essential: capitalism. Capitalism originated as a European ideal. Due to our country's strong ties to European culture, it makes sense that we would adopt the system and teach it as though it were the only way to exist. But in reality, many other societies had different economic systems under which they were able to flourish. Before capitalism took Europe by storm, most small European countries existed in a feudal system, a regionally based self-supporting economic system where feudal lords owned land and allowed peasants to live on it as long as they provided a certain amount of their agricultural profits to the lords. Any excess profits would be kept by the peasants, essentially prioritizing the worker over the landowner. Furthermore, guilds like modern-day workers' unions were organized by industries to maintain a local monopoly on production, ensuring a decent standard of living for those involved. Capitalism began to emerge with the age of new technology. Once global trade became accessible, merchant capitalists were able to acquire foreign goods at low prices and mark them up when returning to their European towns due to the supply and demand chain. The European countries were able to profit off of these marked up exotic goods by enforcing high taxes on imported goods. This led to an economic boom in European countries embracing foreign trade and domestic capitalism. With flourishing economies, these countries were now able to fund colonization expeditions, forging new empires that would become capitalist monopolies for the mother countries, as well as for the indigenous people who already occupied the spaces and had their own systems of government and economics in place. Capitalism has had a direct impact on colonization, as it led to the aristocracy in Europe to place a higher monetary value on land. Land and resources were now a commodity, and people began decimating their environments in order to extract every commodification they could. In Europe, this meant the aristocracy, who had once existed as landlords in the feudal system, began stealing land away from the peasant farmers who had once used it for agriculture. Peasant farmers, now evicted from their land, were unable to make money from agriculture without owning their own property. This led to a major wealth gap in Europe. Luxury goods coming in from other countries and the new spike to the economy meant that basic necessities such as food became more expensive. Many peasants began starving to death as a result. Begging was punished harshly in post-feudal Europe as well, because the notion of handouts challenged the fledgling capitalist system. With no other way to feed themselves, many of Europe's poorest became indentured servants, helping to colonize land in exchange for the promise that they might get some of their own. In areas now colonized by Europeans, the high priority that was placed on land ownership as a means to commodify the environment was not usually understood by the indigenous people. In many cultures, land was not seen as an entity one owns, but rather something that can be used or borrowed from the earth. Instead of attempting to understand these cultures and their ways of existing, Europeans determined that since capitalism is the final economic system, those living outside the system must be backwards, less evolved, and thus less human than them. To the European, people living outside of the capitalist culture they were creating were less human than them and needed to be civilized. The physical and cultural genocide that Europeans would commit over the next several centuries could thus be defended as inevitable, a stepping stone to creating a better capitalist world. As global trade expanded, new merchant capitalists bought goods locally in Europe and exported them globally. In doing this, they were taking production away from the community and further emphasizing the value of profits over the livelihood of their communities. This meant that merchants were able to continue to profit off of the goods they were selling at the highest prices, while craftsmen now had to compete globally to keep up with the shifting economy. Under the capitalist system, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. With craftsmen and farming peasants now suffering as merchants and landowners began to get richer, production started to become a high priority. With the introduction of the industrial age, once skilled workers became forced to work minimum wage jobs in factories to afford a basic livelihood. This can be seen as the final step in the capitalist system. With the environment and communities already commodified, now the individual began to become a commodity as well. With the introduction of factories, workers became indispensable. They had few rights reserved to them, and as a result worked in heinous conditions. If they disagreed with the conditions under which they labored, they were easy to replace. Furthermore, excess profits from the factories did not go to the people producing the goods, but to the owners of the factories. In 1847, at the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, Karl Marx, a German philosopher, published the Communist Manifesto. In it, he criticized the capitalist system, calling out society for what it had become, and disputing the myth that capitalism was the inevitable future of the world. Marx called for class consciousness, for people to become aware of where they stood in social class, and to buy out of the ideologies that subdued them to remain in these positions. Marx pointed out that a majority of people were victims to false consciousness, a sense of contentment in which one is effectively keeping the massive proletariat class dormant under the minority bourgeoisie. Marx believed that dominant ideologies, such as those of culture and religion, work in favor of the rich and against the poor. He said, mass culture has replaced religion, as both worked as tactics to satisfy the poor with their lot in life without questioning the external systems that have put them there. When one believes that heaven is an inevitable reward for them, they are less compelled to act out and demand change for their lives, and more content waiting for the change that is expected to come to them on its own. According to Marx, under capitalism, the economy was regarded as the foundation or base of society. The cultural, political, and social forms of life, which Marx referred to as superstructures, are created out of this base and serve to develop and extenuate the economic base. Examples of these superstructures are institutions such as government, prisons, marriage, police, and education. These institutions were created out of the capitalist base and depend on systemic inequality, just as capitalism does, in order to keep those on top in their coveted positions of power. As a result, the powerful remain powerful with access to the best institutions, while the oppressed remain in oppression. When examining capitalism as the base for superstructures of injustice, civil rights activist Angela Davis said, "Racism cannot be separated from capitalism. Just as capitalism cannot work without the rich remaining in oppression, systems built on top of capitalism cannot exist without the oppressed remaining oppressed. Capitalism thus fuels systems of inequality such as racism, sexism, and homophobia." For those who argue that capitalism is the inevitable final frontier of economic development, these connected issues are necessary evils. Some can identify the connections between capitalism and systemic oppression, but argue that capitalism is too engulfed in our society now. On one hand, they are right. We live in a consumerist culture. Products carry meaning in our society. Nikes and Skechers will both protect your feet when running, but one is worth more due to the clout it carries in society. Yet, there can still be hope. Economists who predicted capitalism is the final system are only looking at the markets and not the people. They cannot predict what the human race will do. Humanity is full of surprises, and while the world can sometimes appear to follow a pattern, in the end, nobody can know what will happen next. Marx believed that the end of capitalist oppression will come once people are able to embrace a class consciousness, to see how these systems are all interconnected, and to understand that capitalism is not the final system. Perhaps a system free of oppression is possible. We just need visionaries to dream of it. To be a visionary, to dream of a new system, one must first understand that the existing system is not inevitable, that nothing is inevitable. Once we think outside of our current system, we can see that alternatives to capitalism are possible. Countries like Denmark, Iceland, and Cuba have embraced alternative forms of economics, and the results have been astounding. Denmark is currently the least polluted country in the world. Cuba has been able to restore coral reefs that have become relatively extinct throughout the rest of the world. Iceland is currently ranked the #1 country for gender equality. When we look outside the box, a better system can be possible. Aside from countries with alternatives to capitalism, in the United States, revolutionaries are working to speak out for other systems. Senator Bernie Sanders has been an avid supporter of socialism for the duration of his career, and on the topic he has said, "What being a socialist means is that you hold out a vision of society where poverty is absolutely unnecessary, where international relations are not based on greed, but on cooperation, where human beings can own the means of production and work together rather than having to work as semi-slaves to other people who can hire and fire." At the beginning of his career, Sanders seemed like a radical, and many were unwilling to listen to his ideas. At the height of her activism, Angela Davis was seen as a danger to society. Many feared her anti-capitalist sentiment as a threat to the current ways of American democracy. Yet, today, the ideas that these visionaries encouraged are starting to ignite. New leaders in the Democratic Party, such as Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, are taking up issues Senator Sanders has stood behind for decades. More activists are following in the footsteps of Davis and denouncing the current system of economy for perpetuating such toxic inequality. We are beginning to see a new generation of people emerge into class consciousness, and we can hope for a future where people are no longer blinded by the myth that capitalism is inevitable.